Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories, where we invite you to board the legendary Midnight Express. On a frigid winter's night, this luxurious train glides from London to Edinburgh, its carriages filled with a curated assembly of suspicious souls. But when a sudden blizzard traps them in the desolate Scottish Highlands, the journey becomes a crucible of secrets. For one passenger will not survive till morning, and the Queen of Crime herself is here to unravel the truth. The great beast hissed, a plume of steam billowing into the frigid January air of King's Cross Station like a ghostly sigh of anticipation. It was the Midnight Express, a name that promised not merely transportation, but an experience. A ribbon of gleaming carriages, each window a warm, golden eye against the encroaching London gloom. It was a world unto itself, a microcosm of society about to be sealed and set in motion. And as is so often the case in such enclosed worlds, it was filled to the brim with secrets. One must always observe. It is the small, seemingly insignificant details that betray the deepest truths. From my vantage point in a quiet corner of the dining car, I Mr. Alistair Finch, a man whose life has been spent wrestling with the certainties of Latin declensions and the ambiguities of Greek philosophy, found the present company a far more compelling puzzle than any ancient text. My trip to Edinburgh for a lecture on the Stoics was, it seemed, to be enlivened by a rather different sort of human drama. The undisputed centre of this drama, a vortex of vulgar energy, was Sir Reginald Thorne. A man built on a scale that suggested nature had been overly generous with the raw materials, but rather slapdash with the finishing. He was a titan of industry with the table manners of a boor. He barked at the waiters, his voice a gravelly boom that sliced through the polite murmur of the carriage. His face, ruddy and fleshy, was a testament to a life of excess. His eyes, small and porcine, missed nothing and forgave less. He was, in short, a man universally disliked, and he seemed to revel in the fact. Across the aisle he was holding court, or rather, holding his companions hostage. His private secretary, a wispy, nervous creature named Lawrence Peabody, flinched every time his employer spoke. Peabody was a man perpetually hunched, as if expecting a blow, his spectacles perpetually sliding down his thin nose. He was the shadow to Sir Reginald's oppressive son, a study in beige subservience. Seated with them, though clearly against her will, was Lady Annabel Croft. She was a delicate thing, pale and ethereal, with large, frightened eyes that seemed to absorb the world's sorrows. She was an orchid in a butcher's shop. One could not help but feel a pang of pity for her. Her recent inheritance, I had gleaned from the society pages, had been entangled with Sir Reginald's business dealings following the tragic, and some said convenient, death of her father. She clutched a silver locket at her throat as if it were a talisman against the evil eye, which in the form of Sir Reginald was staring directly at her. Her companion, Miss Elena Vance, sat ramrod straight beside her. She was a stark contrast to her charge, plain, severe and utterly still. Her gaze was level and unnervingly direct. If Lady Annabel was a frightened deer, Miss Vance was the stoic, silent guardian of the forest. She said little, but her eyes followed Sir Reginald's every move with an intensity that was far from deferential. She was, I mused, a woman of hidden depths, and one suspects those depths were not filled with charitable thoughts. Ah, but the little theatre of the dining car had more players yet. In a booth further down sat the Right Honourable Cecil Beaumont, MP. He was the very picture of a modern politician, sleek, silver-haired, with a smile that was both charming and entirely meaningless. He was nursing a brandy, his posture one of relaxed elegance, yet I noticed the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of his signet ring against the crystal glass. A nervous habit, perhaps. He and Sir Reginald had exchanged a look earlier, a fleeting glance of such condensed venom that it could have curdled the cream on the table. One does not need to be a mind reader to know that bad blood flowed between them. Then there was the splash of colour and drama that was Miss Genevieve Drake. A star of the London stage, though perhaps one whose light was beginning to dim, She swept into the carriage swathed in fur and melodrama. Her voice was a husky, theatrical whisper designed to carry. "My dear, the chill, it is simply too barbarous," she had declared to no one in particular. She was seated with Major Alastair Fitzwilliam, a man who looked as though he had been carved from old oak. He had a distinguished limp, a ramrod posture that even sitting could not disguise, and a gaze that held the quiet sorrow of a man who had seen too much. He listened to Miss Drake's prattling with a kind of weary patience, but his eyes, when they drifted towards Sir Reginald Thorne, hardened into chips of flint. Finally, there was Dr. Arbuthnot, a man who seemed to be in a personal and protracted war with sobriety. He was a large, shambling bear of a man, his tweed suit rumpled, his face a road map of burst capillaries. He kept to himself in a corner, his companion a bottle of whisky, but his sullen glares in Sir Reginald's direction were impossible to miss. Every so often he would mutter into his glass, dark, guttural sounds of displeasure. The train gathered speed, its rhythmic clatter a soothing lullaby of progress, leaving the lights of London far behind. It was a self-contained world, hurtling through the darkness. The conversations, the tensions, the unspoken histories of these dozen or so souls in the first-class carriage, all sealed within this metal tube. It is in such circumstances, my dear reader, that the thin veneer of civilization is most vulnerable. A sudden jolt, a change in pressure, and things have a tendency to crack. Dinner was a strained affair. Sir Reginald, having consumed a prodigious amount of claret, grew louder and more offensive. He made a thinly veiled joke about politicians and their price, earning a reptilian smile from Cecil Beaumont. He dismissed Miss Drake's latest theatrical endeavour, one he had apparently financed, as a damned foolish waste of money, causing her to flush a most unbecoming shade of crimson. He reminded Major Fitzwilliam of some past financial misfortune, a comment that made the Major's hand clench into a white-knuckled fist. "Peabody, you fool, more wine," he bellowed, and the secretary scurried to obey. Sir Reginald then turned his attention back to Lady Annabel. "Your father, my dear," he slurred, leaning unpleasantly close, "was a good man. A sentimental man. Sentiment has no place in business." A lesson he learned too late, I'm afraid. Lady Annabel visibly shrank, and it was Miss Vance who spoke, her voice quiet but as cold and sharp as an icicle. "Sir Reginald, I believe Lady Annabel is tired." "We will be retiring to our compartment," Thorne guffawed. "As you wish. Run along, little birds." One by one, the passengers drifted away, leaving a trail of resentment in their wake. I returned to my own compartment, the words of Seneca on my mind. Asterisk, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end asterisk. Little did I know how prophetic that thought would prove to be. The train was now deep into the countryside, the darkness outside absolute. The rhythmic rocking was a comfort, and I must have drifted off. I was awoken by a change, a sudden, grinding lurch, followed by an unnerving silence. The familiar motion of the train had ceased. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside, a mournful, banshee's wail that spoke of wild, desolate places. I drew back the curtain. We were surrounded by a world of white. A blizzard, a furious, swirling vortex of snow had enveloped us. The train was motionless, a tiny outpost of warmth and light in a vast, indifferent wilderness. A commotion in the corridor drew me to my door. The conductor, a stern-faced Scotsman named Sealers Croft, was trying to calm the passengers who had emerged from their compartments. "Just a wee spot of bother," he announced, his professional calm a little frayed at the edges. "A snowdrift on the line ahead. The telegraph's down too. We're quite stuck, I'm afraid. We'll just have to wait for a plough to clear the way." We were trapped, a closed circle. The elegant carriage had in an instant become a cage. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Morning came, not with a dawn, but with a gradual lightening of the oppressive grey. The snow was still falling, thick and relentless, burying us deeper. A strange sort of camaraderie, born of shared misfortune, began to settle over the passengers. Breakfast was served in the dining car, a subdued affair, but one person was missing. "Has anyone seen Sir Reginald?" Cecil Beaumont asked, his smooth voice cutting through the quiet. "The brute is probably sleeping off the claret," Miss Drake sniffed, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "The conductor, Mr. Croft, looked concerned. His man Peabody says he cannot get a response. The door to his compartment is locked from the inside." A frisson of something, not yet fear, but a sharp, cold intrigue, ran through the carriage. Mr. Croft, accompanied by Major Fitzwilliam and myself, my scholarly curiosity, I confess, got the better of me, proceeded to Sir Reginald's compartment. The conductor knocked, then banged his fist on the door. "Sir Reginald, are you in there?" Only the howling wind replied. "We'll have to break it down," the Major said, his voice firm. He and the conductor put their shoulders to the door. It shuddered, groaned, and then burst open with a crack of splintering wood. The scene within was one of dreadful stillness. Sir Reginald Thorne was slumped in his armchair, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. The remnants of a glass of brandy sat on the table beside him, but it was not an empty glass that drew the eye. It was the ornate silver letter opener, one I had noticed earlier on his desk, embedded deep in his chest, its hilt protruding like a final, mocking exclamation mark. A dark, ugly stain had blossomed on the pristine white of his shirt. His small eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an expression of profound and terminal surprise. The cage had not just trapped us, it had trapped a murderer. And as I looked at the faces of the passengers crowded in the corridor, faces pale with shock and a dawning, terrible suspicion, I knew that every single one of them had wished this man dead. The little grey cells, as a dear friend of mine is fond of saying, began to stir. This was no common crime. This was a puzzle meticulously constructed, and we were all now pieces within it. Chapter 2. One must impose order on chaos. It is the first principle of civilization, and I might add, of criminal investigation. In the absence of Scotland Yard, a role fell, it seemed to me. My only qualification was a lifetime spent in the pursuit of logic, and a perhaps unhealthy interest in the frailties of human nature. The conductor, Mr. Croft, a man whose rulebook did not contain a chapter on dealing with homicide in the midst of a blizzard, looked at me with a mixture of desperation and hope. "A professor, you say?" he had asked. "Of the classics," I had clarified. "But the patterns of human behaviour, Mr. Croft, have changed remarkably little since the time of the Caesars." He seemed to accept this, and with his tacit approval, our small, isolated world was officially placed under investigation. The first order of business was the *locus delicti*, the scene of the crime. I requested that everyone return to the dining car, leaving Major Fitzwilliam to stand guard at the door of the late Sir Reginald's compartment. "No one enters or leaves, Major," I instructed. "The integrity of the puzzle must be maintained." He gave a curt, military nod. I entered the compartment, Mr. Croft at my side. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and expensive brandy. Sir Reginald's body remained in the armchair, a grotesque monarch holding court in a kingdom of one. Ah, but one must be detached. The body is merely the final, ugly fact. The truth lies in the details that precede it. The room was a first-class sleeper, compact and luxurious. A bed, neatly turned down, a small desk littered with business papers. A heavy travelling coat slung over a chair, and the victim. I knelt, careful not to touch anything. The weapon, as I had noted, was Sir Reginald's own silver letter opener. A crime of opportunity, perhaps, or a deliberate choice laden with irony, a tool for opening correspondence used for a more final sort of opening. "The door was locked from the inside, you are certain?" I asked the conductor. "I bolted. We had to break the frame to get in, a locked room mystery, the most classic of conundrums." My mind immediately began to sift through the possibilities. Suicide was out of the question. One does not commit suicide by stabbing oneself in the chest with such force and then bolting the door. Therefore, the murderer had killed him and then vanished from a sealed room. Impossible. No. Merely a challenge to the little grey cells. I examined the lock. It was a standard bolt, simple and solid. I then turned my attention to the window. It was a heavy, sliding pane, and I saw at once that it was slightly ajar, no more than an inch. A blast of icy air and fine, powdery snow funneled through the gap. "Was this window open when you found him?" I asked Croft. "I can't be sure," he stammered. "There was a lot of commotion." I peered out into the white maelstrom. It was a sheer drop to the snow-covered ground several feet below. No footprints would survive this blizzard. Could someone have entered or exited this way? It seemed a feat worthy of a circus acrobat, but one must not discount the improbable. My eyes scanned the floor. The carpet was a deep claret, excellent for hiding stains, but not, it seemed, for hiding everything. Near the leg of the desk, almost invisible against the dark pattern, was a small object. I retrieved my handkerchief and carefully picked it up. It was a button, small, mother of pearl, intricately carved. It was not from Sir Reginald's suit, nor did it look like it belonged on a man's garment at all. It was delicate, feminine. I pocketed the button, carefully wrapped. Clue number 1, I moved to the desk. Papers were strewn about, contracts and ledgers. On top of one pile was a railway timetable. A page was open to the London to Edinburgh route, and a single time, 1:15 a.m., had been circled in ink. Why, was it an appointment Sir Reginald was meant to keep, or a time he wished to remember? My search of the compartment yielded one final curiosity. In the waste paper basket, amongst cigar stubs and a discarded newspaper, were the tiny, torn fragments of a letter. Piecing them together was a painstaking task, but the result was tantalizing. The paper was of a fine, scented quality. The handwriting was elegant, looping. Only a few phrases were legible. "Cannot continue this way. The final payment is due, and you will get what you deserve." It was unsigned, a threat clearly. But from whom? Having absorbed all I could from the chamber of death, I returned to the dining car. The atmosphere was electric with fear and suspicion. The other passengers, now my suspects, sat in tense, silent groups. They were no longer fellow travellers. They were characters in a tragedy, each one a potential villain. I decided to speak with them individually, beginning with the man who had last seen the victim in a professional capacity. His secretary, Mr. Peabody. We sat at a small table, the white landscape rushing past in my memory, though we were deathly still. Peabody was trembling, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his teacup. "Mr. Peabody," I began gently, "I need you to tell me about last night." He was in a frightful mood," the secretary stammered. "Worse than usual. He had been drinking heavily. After he insulted everyone, he dismissed me. Said he had some private business to attend to. That was the last I saw of him." "What time was this?" "Just after 10 o'clock, I believe. I went straight to my own compartment." "Did he seem worried, fearful?" Peabody gave a short, humourless laugh. "Sir Reginald, fear was something he inspired in others, Professor, not something he felt himself." An interesting choice of words. "And this private business, do you know what it was?" He hesitated, his eyes darting around the carriage. "He was to meet someone, he didn't say who. He just told me to make sure he was not to be disturbed after midnight." "After midnight," I repeated. The time on the timetable was 1:15 a.m. "And these torn fragments of a letter," I said, laying them on the table. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" He peered at them through his thick spectacles. He went pale. I may have seen it before, on correspondence. From Miss Drake, Miss Genevieve Drake. The plot, as they say, thickens. My interview with the actress was a performance in itself. She was draped across her seat, a hand to her forehead, the very picture of a grieving or at least a shocked acquaintance. "It is too dreadful," she breathed. "Poor Reggie, so full of life." "You were not on the best of terms with him last night, Miss Drake," I observed mildly. "He made some rather disparaging remarks about your latest play." Her eyes flashed with genuine fire. "The man was a Philistine, an oaf with a checkbook. He bankrolled the play, yes, but he understood nothing of art. He threatened to withdraw his backing for my next project. That surely was a motive. I am told you own a theatrical dagger, a prop, I said, changing tack. May I see it? Her face clouded. My dagger, why on earth? She rummaged in her large handbag, and then her expression changed to one of confusion, then alarm. It's gone. It was here last night, I'm sure of it. Someone has taken it. A missing weapon, how very convenient, or how very incriminating. Next, I spoke with the politician, Cecil Beaumont. He was all smooth composure, a man used to navigating treacherous waters. A dreadful business, Professor Finch, a black mark on the reputation of this fine railway. You and Sir Reginald were not friends, I gather. A thin smile touched his lips. Friendship is a strong word. We had dealings. Sir Reginald was a man who collected secrets, Professor. He enjoyed having leverage. Let us just say he was in possession of certain information regarding my past that could have proven embarrassing. He was not above a little light blackmail. And was a payment due? I pressed. Beaumont's composure finally cracked. For a second his mask of urbanity slipped, revealing a glimpse of cold fury beneath. The man was a parasite. He got what was coming to him, but I assure you it was not by my hand. I was in my compartment from 11 o'clock onwards, reading government reports. Terribly dull, but a solid alibi, I think you'll find. Solid, perhaps, but uncorroborated. In this isolated carriage, every alibi was. My conversations with the others followed a similar pattern. Each of them had a powerful, compelling reason to despise Sir Reginald Thorne. Major Fitzwilliam spoke in clipped, bitter tones of how Thorne had ruthlessly foreclosed on his ancestral home, leaving his family destitute. The man had no honour, he stated, his voice tight with controlled rage. He claimed to have been in the smoking car until late, but admitted he was alone. Dr. Arbuthnot, now nursing a cup of black coffee instead of whiskey, was belligerent. Thorne, the man was a cancer. He sat on the board of the hospital. He had me struck off, disgraced, over a petty disagreement, ruined my life for sport. The doctor claimed to have drunk himself into a stupor in his compartment, a state from which no one could apparently rouse him. Another convenient and unverifiable alibi. The most heart-wrenching story came from Lady Annabel, who spoke in a whisper, with Miss Vance sitting protectively by her side. Sir Reginald. He destroyed my father, she said, tears welling in her large, sad eyes. He was Papa's business partner. He cheated him, swindled him out of everything. Papa, they said his death was an accident to fall. But I know it wasn't. The shame and the ruin, it killed him. Sir Reginald was a murderer. Lady Annabel was in my care the entire night, Miss Vance interjected, her voice firm. She was overwrought. I gave her a sleeping draught and she did not stir until morning. As they spoke, my eyes were drawn to the silver locket Lady Annabel nervously fingered. May I asked gently. She hesitated, then handed it to me. I clicked it open. On one side was a portrait of a kind-faced, elderly man, her father, presumably. On the other side was a much older photograph, a snapshot of two young men in boating blazers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a younger, leaner version of her father. The other, unmistakably, was a young Reginald Thorne. They had been friends once. It made his betrayal all the more monstrous. I handed back the locket. Thank you, my lady. The investigation was yielding a surfeit of motives, a veritable feast of hatred. It was like a Greek tragedy, with Sir Reginald as the tyrannical Creon and a carriage full of Antigones, each with a justification for rebellion. But a motive does not make a murderer. The means and the opportunity were still shrouded in the swirling snow outside. I re-examined my clues. The torn letter, which Peabody had attributed to Miss Drake. The missing theatrical dagger. The circled time on the timetable, and the small, mother-of-pearl button. I looked at the fashionable, expensive clothes of Miss Drake and Lady Annabel. The button did not seem to match their style. It was simpler, more functional. Like one from a lady's glove or a blouse. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the train grew heavier, more poisonous. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. We were suspended in time and space, a rolling stock full of suspicion. Accusatory glances were exchanged. Miss Drake loudly proclaimed her certainty that Major Fitzwilliam, with his violent military temper, was the culprit. Cecil Beaumont subtly hinted that a disgraced and desperate man like Dr. Arbuthnot was capable of anything. Ah, but dear reader, the truth is often hidden in plain sight, obscured by the fog of our own assumptions. Everyone was looking for the person with the strongest reason to kill, but they were failing to ask the more important question. How was it done? How does a killer stab a man and then vanish from a room bolted from the inside, leaving only a single, slightly open window as a clue? The answer to that question, I felt certain, would lead to the truth. And the truth, I suspected, was far more complex than a simple act of revenge. Chapter 3. The afternoon bled into a long, twilight evening. The train's emergency lights cast a pale, spectral glow over the carriages, creating long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock our predicament. The storm outside had not lessened its fury. If anything, the wind howled with a more personal, vindictive rage. Paranoia, which had been a quiet passenger until now, began to take a more prominent seat. It sat at every table, a ghostly guest at our grim makeshift supper. People began to watch each other, truly watch each other, no longer with polite curiosity, but with the keen, sharp-edged scrutiny of those who suspect they are sharing their cage with a predator. A sudden movement would draw a flinch. A raised voice would cause heads to snap around. Every passenger was now both a potential victim and a potential murderer. It was Miss Genevieve Drake who cracked first. During a tense silence in the dining car, she suddenly pointed a trembling finger at Dr. Arbuthnot. "It was you," she shrieked, her voice a theatrical tremor that was, for once, entirely genuine. "You're the one who ruined your career. You had poison in that bag of yours. Perhaps the knife was just a distraction." Dr. Arbuthnot, who had been morosely staring into a cup of coffee, lumbered to his feet, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You hysterical baggage. If I wanted to kill him, I'd have used something untraceable, not something from your box of children's toys." Major Fitzwilliam rose calmly. "That's enough. Hysteria will help no one." His calm, however, only seemed to fray the nerves of others. We were a tinderbox, and Miss Drake had just struck a match. It was in the midst of this rising chaos that I decided to speak once more with Mr. Peabody. The secretary was the key, I felt. He knew Sir Reginald's business, his appointments, his enemies. He was a walking repository of secrets. I found him in his small, second-class compartment, a world away from the luxury his employer had enjoyed, looking more frayed and wretched than ever. "Mr. Peabody," I said, closing the door behind me for privacy, "we must speak plainly. You told me Sir Reginald was expecting someone after midnight. You must have an idea of who it was." He wrung his hands, his knuckles white. "I don't. He was very secretive the last few days. He had me retrieve a document from his safe, an old will. An old will," my interest piqued. "What about his current one?" "He just had a new one drawn up," Peabody whispered, his eyes wide. "He was in a foul temper about it. Said he was leaving every last penny to a dog's home, just to spite everyone. He was carrying it with him, the new one. He was going to have it formally witnessed and lodged in Edinburgh." This was a revelation of the highest order. A new will, disinheriting everyone who might have had a financial motive. If that will were to disappear, and an older will naming a beneficiary were to surface, the motive would not be revenge, but pure, unadulterated greed. "And who benefited from this older will, Mr. Peabody?" I asked, my voice level. He licked his dry lips. He had always promised to see me right, a small legacy for my years of service." Before he could say another word, the train gave a violent shudder. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into absolute blackness. A collective scream echoed through the carriages. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and panicked breathing. Then, after an eternal 10 seconds, the emergency lights sputtered back to life, casting their eerie half-light once more. In that brief moment of darkness and confusion, something had happened. I heard a thud and a weak groan from the corridor. I threw open the door to Peabody's compartment. The secretary was not there. A few feet down the narrow passage, he was slumped against the wall, his eyes rolling back in his head. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming on his temple. He had been struck. Major Fitzwilliam and I helped the groaning man to a seat. Dr. Arbuthnot, his earlier anger forgotten, rushed over with his medical bag, his professional instincts taking over. "Concussion," he grunted after a brief examination. "He's lucky his skull isn't fractured." He was hit with something heavy and blunt. The attack on Peabody changed everything. It was no longer a single, isolated act of violence. The murderer was still active, and was now desperate enough to strike again to ensure a secret remained buried. The secret, I was certain, of the two wills. Peabody had been on the verge of telling me who benefited from the older will, and for that he had been silenced. I left the doctor to tend to the semi-conscious secretary and returned to the scene of the first crime. I needed to rethink everything: the locked room, the open window, the motive. My mind felt like a library where all the books had been thrown on the floor. I needed to recatalogue the facts, to find the single thread that would bind them all together. I stood in the doorway of Sir Reginald's compartment, the broken locker testament to our violent entry. I replayed the sequence of events in my mind. The killer enters, stabs Sir Reginald, and then, how do they leave a room bolted from the inside? The window. I kept coming back to the window. Could someone have climbed out into a raging blizzard? Highly unlikely. Could they have reached in from the outside to bolt the door after leaving? Impossible. The bolt is on the inside, several feet from the window. So the door must have been bolted by someone inside the room. And since Sir Reginald was deceased, that left only the murderer, who then dematerialized. The notion was absurd. There had to be a logical explanation. My gaze drifted from the door to the other features of the room. The communication cord for emergencies hanging by the bed. The heating vent, a small grille near the floor, the heavy velvet curtains. I let my eyes trace the layout of the compartment, the flow of space. And then I saw it. A detail so small, so utterly mundane that I had overlooked it completely. Everyone had. It was a piece of string. A thin, black thread, almost invisible against the dark carpet, running from beneath the compartment door out into the corridor. It was no more than 2 feet long, and at the end of it, tied in a neat little knot, was a small lead weight, the kind used to keep curtains hanging straight. My heart began to beat a little faster. The little grey cells were not just stirring, they were positively fizzing. A string, a weight, a bolt. The mechanics of the impossible trick began to assemble themselves in my mind with the beautiful, satisfying click of a well-made lock. The murderer did not vanish. They simply walked out and closed the door behind them. I knew now how it was done. The how was the key that would unlock the who. I gathered the small piece of string and the weight, my evidence now almost complete. All that remained was to connect the method to the motive and the individual. I walked back towards the dining car, my mind racing. I had the physical clues, a mother of pearl button and a piece of string. I had the psychological clues, a plethora of motives, a secret will, and a desperate attempt at silence. I needed to arrange them in the correct order. I sat down at an empty table, taking the sugar cubes from the bowl. Each cube was a suspect. I placed them on the tablecloth, a map of our confined world. Miss Drake, the actress, Mr. Beaumont, the politician, Major Fitzwilliam, the soldier, Dr. Arbuthnot, the physician, Lady Annabel, the heiress, and her silent companion, Miss Vance, and of course the now victimized Mr. Peabody. Everyone had a motive for revenge. But the attack on Peabody suggested something more. It suggested a financial gain. The new will, the one that left everything to a dog's home, was the crucial element. It was being carried by Sir Reginald. Where was it now? I had not found it on his body or in his compartment. Had the killer taken it? If so, why? To destroy it, ensuring that the old will would be the one executed. The beneficiary of that old will was the murderer. Peabody had been about to tell me, but his words were a small legacy for my years of service. That did not sound like a motive for murder and a conspiracy. He was a piece of the puzzle, but not the central one. Who else stood to gain? I looked down at my sugar cubes. My eyes fell upon two of them sitting side by side, Lady Annabel and Miss Vance, the frightened heiress and her quiet, watchful protector. Lady Annabel certainly believed she had been cheated. Perhaps the old will restored her father's fortune to her. It was a powerful motive, but something about it felt wrong. Lady Annabel seemed genuinely terrified, lacking the iron nerve required for such a brutal and cunning crime. Miss Vance, on the other hand, she possessed that nerve in abundance. Still, she had no apparent motive, other than loyalty to her employer. I picked up the clue of the button. It was plain, functional. The kind of button one would find on a travelling blouse or a pair of ladies' gloves. I thought of the women in the carriage. Miss Drake's attire was flamboyant. Lady Annabel's was delicate and expensive, but Miss Vance, her clothes were severe, practical, chosen for durability, not for show. I could easily imagine such a button on her cuff. The pieces were beginning to fall into a pattern, a terrible, shocking pattern. The howling of the wind outside seemed to be whispering a name. The chaos was resolving into a single, horrifying point of clarity. I knew who the killer was, and I knew that the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. Chapter 4. The stage was set for the final act. I requested that everyone, including the groggy but conscious Mr. Peabody, gather in the dining car. The oil lamps flickered, casting our faces in a dramatic chiaroscuro of light and shadow. The remaining passengers assembled, their faces a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and wary curiosity. They looked at me as if I were a soothsayer about to pronounce a doom. In a way, I suppose I was. I stood at the head of the carriage, the small, damning pieces of evidence resting on the table before me. A mother-of-pearl button, a torn letter, and a length of black thread with a small weight attached. "We find ourselves in a most unfortunate position," I began, my voice quiet but carrying in the strained silence. "We are trapped in this train with a murderer. However, the period of uncertainty is over. The culprit is in this room." A collective gasp, a shifting of bodies. Eyes darted from one face to another. The police, when they eventually arrive, will be looking for three things: means, motive, and opportunity. Let us examine them. The means was Sir Reginald's own letter opener. The opportunity for anyone in this carriage was ample. That leaves us with motive, and in that we are blessed with an embarrassment of riches. I proceeded systematically to address each suspect in turn, outlining their powerful reasons for wishing Sir Reginald Thorne dead. "Mr. Beaumont," I said, turning to the politician, "Sir Reginald was blackmailing you. His death frees you from a career-ending scandal, a powerful motive. Major Fitzwilliam, he ruined your family and took your home. You sought the restoration of your honour, a classic motive for revenge. Miss Drake. He belittled your art and threatened your financial future. A crime of passion, perhaps. Dr. Arbuthnot. He destroyed your reputation and your livelihood. You hated him with a palpable fury. And Lady Annabel," I said gently, looking at the pale, trembling girl. "You believe with good reason that he was responsible for your father's death and the theft of your inheritance. Justice in its most primitive form." I let the accusations hang in the air. Each one was plausible. Each one was, in its own way, true. "However," I continued, "a motive is not a proof. The true question has always been how the crime was committed. How did the killer escape from a room bolted from the inside?" I held up the piece of thread and the lead weight. "With this, it is a trick, elegant in its simplicity. The murderer was the last person to see Sir Reginald alive in his compartment. After stabbing him, they did not leave immediately. They took this thread, passed it through the keyhole of the door from the inside, and looped it around the handle of the bolt. They then let themselves out, closing the door behind them. Standing in the corridor, they held both ends of the thread. A simple, firm pull would slide the bolt across into its housing. Once the door was bolted, they simply pulled one end of the thread, sliding it free. A tiny piece of string, falling harmlessly to the floor in the corridor to be swept away or ignored. The perfect, impossible crime. A stunned silence greeted my explanation. I saw comprehension dawning on their faces. However, our killer made one small mistake. The string they used was dark, but the lead weight on the end caught under the door, pulling the thread into the room, not out into the corridor. It lay there, a silent confession waiting to be found. I let my gaze travel across the assembled faces, resting finally on the still, severe figure of Miss Elena Vance. A clever trick. One that requires a steady hand, a cool nerve, and meticulous planning. Qualities that are not possessed by someone acting in a fit of rage or passion. This was not a spontaneous act of revenge. This was a cold, calculated execution. The small button I found on the floor belonged to the cuff of your glove, Miss Vance, the one you were wearing last night. Lady Annabel gasped. Elena, no, it's impossible, she was with me. She was with you, my lady, I agreed. But she gave you a sleeping draught, a powerful one. She was then free to move about the train, her alibi perfectly secured by your unconsciousness. Miss Vance did not flinch. She simply stared back at me, her expression unreadable. You have no proof, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. A button and a piece of string, it's absurd. Ah, but the proof lies in the motive, I countered. And your motive is the most powerful of all. You see, I did a little deduction concerning your identity. You are not merely a companion. The society pages mentioned Lady Annabel's previous companion left suddenly. You took her place only a month ago. Just long enough to ingratiate yourself. Your name is not Elena Vance. Your real name is Elena Verity. And your father was Arthur Verity, another of Sir Reginald's business partners. A man he ruined utterly. A man who took his own life 15 years ago, leaving a wife and a young daughter to face penury and shame alone. Your entire life has been a long, patient wait for this moment. Getting close to Lady Annabel was merely the final step in your plan to get close to the man who destroyed your family. Miss Vance's composure finally broke. A flicker of profound hatred, pure and undiluted, crossed her features. He was a monster, he deserved to die. Perhaps, I said softly, but that is not for us to decide, and you did not act alone. All eyes now turned to the pale, sweating form of Mr. Lawrence Peabody. The attack on you was a charade, was it not, Mr. Peabody? A diversion. The new will Sir Reginald was carrying, the one leaving his fortune to a dog's home, is missing because you took it, and you destroyed it. Miss Vance committed the murder, but you were her accomplice. For with the new will gone, an older one comes into effect. An older will that, I suspect, does not leave you with a small legacy, but with a very substantial portion of Sir Reginald's fortune. Peabody began to sob, his face crumbling. He promised, years ago he promised, then he was going to give it all away to dogs, asterisk, after all my years of service, of humiliation. So you and Miss Vance conspired, I concluded. She would get her revenge, and you would get your fortune. You provided her with the information she needed, the layout of the train, Sir Reginald's habits. The torn letter I found was from you to her, finalizing the details of your ghastly arrangement. She attacked you to cast you as a victim, and to stop you from revealing the details of the will under my questioning. A desperate but ultimately revealing act. It was over. The puzzle was solved, every piece locked into place. Miss Vance, or rather Miss Verity, stood up. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming companion. She was a figure of chilling resolve, an avenging angel from a Greek tragedy. Do not pretend this is about justice, Professor, she said, her voice laced with contempt. There is no justice for men like Thorne. There is only retribution. I regret nothing. As she spoke, a new sound penetrated the carriage. A low, grinding rumble from the distance, growing steadily louder. The snowplough. The outside world was coming to reclaim us. Our period of isolation was at an end. The conductor, his face grim, moved to stand by the two conspirators. The play was over. The midnight express finally pulled into a small, snowbound station hours later, where the police were waiting. The transfer of the prisoners and the body was a grim, quiet affair. The remaining passengers disembarked, scattering into the cold morning, forever bound by the terrible events of that night. As for me, I continued my journey to Edinburgh. The lecture on the Stoics awaited. But as I looked out at the passing landscape, a world of pristine, white snow now tainted by the memory of the darkness it had concealed, I found my thoughts were not on the ancient philosophers. They were on the intricate, often tragic, patterns of human desire, on the fine line between justice and revenge, and on the simple truth that the most elegant of puzzles can often have the most brutal of solutions. The truth, my dear reader, is rarely pure and never simple.